Every spring, the same exhausting preparation begins. Gardeners turn the soil with shovels, tillers churn through compacted ground, and the earth that seemed solid a moment before collapses into loose, disconnected particles. It feels productive, it looks like progress, but beneath the surface, something else is happening. Fungal networks that took months to form are severed in seconds. Earthworm tunnels collapse. Microbial communities built across vertical layers suddenly find themselves scattered and exposed. The soil that appeared dead was never dead at all. It was alive, organized, and functioning. And every time it is turned, that organization disappears. Most gardeners never question this. Tilling is what gardening means. Except there is another way. 5 beds. Never turned, never tilled. Producing food every single week of the year. Built once and left alone. This is not a new discovery waiting to be proven. It is an old system that worked for generations before tractors made everyone forget why it mattered. The method is called permanent bed gardening, and at its center lies a principle that contradicts nearly everything modern agriculture teaches about soil preparation. Soil is not an inert substance waiting to be corrected with machinery and chemicals. It is a living ecosystem, and disturbance weakens it. For most of the 20th century, that idea remained marginal, mentioned occasionally by organic gardening advocates, but rarely taken seriously by mainstream agriculture. Yet long before industrial farming redefined what productivity meant, small-scale growers across Europe had already proven that undisturbed soil could outperform plowed ground year after year without declining. The most remarkable example appeared not in rural farmland, but in the dense urban environment of 19th century Paris. Between the 1850s and early 1900s, a community of market gardeners known as maraîchers operated within the city limits, producing vegetables on plots so small they would be considered impractical by modern standards. These growers worked narrow strips of land divided into permanent raised beds that were never plowed. Instead of turning the soil each season, they applied thick layers of horse manure directly to the surface and allowed it to decompose in place. The beds remained in fixed positions year after year, with crops rotating through them in carefully timed sequences. What made this system noteworthy was not the romantic image of urban farming, but the documented productivity that resulted. Agricultural observers visiting these gardens recorded yields that seemed impossible given the limited space involved. A single plot measuring less than an acre could produce multiple harvests of different crops within the same growing season, feeding dozens of families while supplying commercial markets throughout the city. The soil in these beds did not degrade over time. It improved. Fertility increased with each passing year as organic matter accumulated, and microbial populations stabilized within the undisturbed structure. By the time World War I disrupted this system, Parisian market gardens had demonstrated for more than half a century that permanent beds could sustain intensive production without the need for plowing, synthetic fertilizers, or crop failures caused by soil exhaustion. Then tractors arrived, and the logic changed completely. The system those gardeners used was not complicated, but it required understanding something most modern gardening advice ignores. Plants do not simply extract nutrients from soil and grow. They participate in biological exchanges with organisms living beneath the surface, and those exchanges depend on stable environments that take time to develop. When soil is turned repeatedly, those environments never form. The permanent bed system solves this by dividing the growing space into fixed sections that remain undisturbed year after year. In its simplest form, the system uses 5 beds, each dedicated to a different plant family that rotates through the beds in sequence. Bed 1 grows brassicas, cabbage, broccoli, kale, and their relatives. Bed 2 holds alliums, onions, garlic, leeks. Bed 3 supports legumes, beans, and peas that fix nitrogen into the soil as they grow. Bed 4 contains solanaceae, tomatoes, peppers, potatoes, eggplants. Bed 5 accommodates root crops and leafy greens, carrots, beets, lettuce, spinach. Each year, the crops shift to the next bed in the rotation. Brassicas move from bed 1 to bed 2, alliums shift to bed 3, and the cycle continues until each family returns to its original bed 5 years later. This rotation is not arbitrary. Different plant families attract different pests and diseases, and those organisms decline when their host plants disappear from a location for several seasons. Soil pathogens that build up around tomato roots cannot survive when beans or onions occupy that bed the following year. Pests that target cabbage family plants find nothing to feed on when the bed shifts to growing carrots instead. The 5-year gap between repetitions is long enough to break most pest and disease cycles without requiring chemical intervention. But rotation alone does not explain why the system works. The second principle is equally important. Instead of tilling compost into the soil, growers apply it directly to the surface in layers 2 to 4 inches deep. This mimics what happens naturally in forests where leaves fall and decompose in place rather than being mixed into the ground by machinery. Earthworms, fungi, and bacteria gradually incorporate the organic matter downward, building soil structure as they work. The soil itself remains undisturbed, allowing fungal networks to extend through the beds and connect plant roots across distances that would otherwise require weeks to establish. Water channels formed by old root passages and earthworm tunnels stay intact, improving drainage and moisture retention simultaneously. Microbial populations organize themselves into stable vertical layers, with different organisms occupying different depths according to oxygen availability and organic matter concentration. The third principle governs timing. Beds are never left empty. As soon as one crop finishes, another is planted immediately in the same space. In spring, lettuce and spinach occupy a bed for 6 to 8 weeks before being replaced by beans. When the beans finish in late summer, fall brassicas are planted in their place and harvested through winter. This succession planting transforms each bed from a single harvest system into a continuous production cycle that can yield 3 or 4 different crops from the same space within a single year. The beds themselves are built to human scale rather than machine scale. 4 feet wide allows a person to reach the center from either side without stepping on the growing area. Length varies depending on available space, but the width remains constant because it is determined by arm reach, not equipment dimensions. Paths between the beds provide access without compacting the soil where plants grow. Together, these 3 elements, crop rotation, surface composting, and succession planting, create a system that functions more like a natural ecosystem than a conventional garden. To understand why leaving soil undisturbed produces better results than turning it, we need to look at what actually exists beneath the surface. Healthy soil is not a uniform substance. It is a structured environment where billions of organisms interact within networks that take months or years to establish. Fungal hyphae extend through the soil like microscopic threads, sometimes stretching for meters in every direction. These fungi form partnerships with plant roots called mycorrhizal associations, where the fungus delivers water and nutrients to the plant in exchange for sugars produced during photosynthesis. A single plant can connect to dozens of fungal networks simultaneously, and those networks can link multiple plants together, allowing them to share resources across distances their roots could never reach alone. When soil is tilled, these fungal threads are cut apart. The networks collapse, and plants lose access to the extended nutrient transport system they depend on. Rebuilding those connections requires weeks of growth, during which the plant operates at reduced capacity. Soil structure itself depends on biological activity that tilling disrupts. Microorganisms produce sticky compounds that bind soil particles into aggregates, small clusters that create pore spaces between them. These pores allow air to penetrate deep into the soil while also holding water in reserve during dry periods. In undisturbed soil, aggregates remain stable and pore spaces stay open. In tilled soil, aggregates break apart, pore spaces collapse, and the soil becomes either compacted when wet or dusty when dry. Water retention suffers immediately. Studies comparing no-dig systems to conventionally tilled gardens consistently show that undisturbed soil holds 20 to 30% more moisture during drought conditions. This difference comes not from adding water, but from preserving the physical structure that allows soil to function as a reservoir. Earthworm populations provide another measurable indicator. In permanent bed systems, earthworm counts often reach 3 to 5 times the numbers found in tilled gardens. These organisms create vertical tunnels that improve drainage and aeration while depositing nutrient-rich castings throughout the soil profile. Their tunnels remain functional for months after the worms move on, but only if the soil is not turned. Microbial biomass, the total weight of living organisms in a given volume of soil, increases significantly in no-dig systems compared to tilled ground. More microbes mean more nutrient cycling, more disease suppression, and more stable soil chemistry. Perhaps most importantly, undisturbed soil accumulates carbon over time instead of releasing it. When soil is turned, oxygen floods into spaces that were previously anaerobic, and microbes rapidly decompose organic matter, releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. In permanent beds, carbon remains sequestered within stable organic compounds that build fertility rather than disappearing as gas. Surface composting works precisely because it cooperates with these biological processes instead of disrupting them. Organic matter applied to the surface decomposes gradually as organisms process it in place, releasing nutrients in forms that plant roots and soil microbes can integrate smoothly. There is no sudden chemical shock, no collapse of structure, and no interruption of the fungal networks that connect the entire system. The soil remains organized, and that organization is what makes continuous productivity possible. Understanding the biology explains why the system works, but it does not answer the practical question most gardeners ask first. How much food can 5 beds actually produce? The answer depends on several factors, but the basic mathematics are straightforward. A bed measuring 4 feet wide and 20 feet long contains 80 square feet of growing space. 5 beds provide 400 square feet total. That is roughly the size of a small bedroom, and it is not enough space to grow all the food a family needs throughout the year. But it can produce a substantial portion of the fresh vegetables that would otherwise come from a grocery store. And with succession planting, each bed can yield 3 or 4 different crops within a single growing season. In spring, one bed might begin with lettuce, spinach, and radishes, which mature in 6 to 8 weeks. As soon as those crops are harvested, beans are planted in the same space and produce for 10 weeks through early summer. When the beans finish, fall brassicas such as kale or cabbage are planted and harvested through autumn and into winter, sometimes lasting 12 weeks or longer. That same 80 square feet has now produced 3 separate crops instead of 1. Multiply that pattern across 5 beds with different crop families rotating through them, and the total output begins to exceed what most people expect from such a small area. A family of 4 will not achieve complete food self-sufficiency from 400 square feet, but they can reduce grocery dependence significantly while gaining access to vegetables fresher and more nutrient-dense than anything available in commercial supply chains. The system works best when expectations remain realistic. Beginners often plant too densely, assuming that more plants will produce more food. In practice, overcrowding reduces yields because plants compete for light, water, and nutrients. Others forget to succession plant and allow beds to sit empty for weeks between crops, losing potential harvests. Some apply insufficient compost during the initial setup, which slows the development of soil biology and limits productivity in the first season. By the second and third years, as soil structure strengthens and microbial populations stabilize, yields typically increase without additional effort. The system becomes more productive over time rather than degrading, which is the opposite of what happens in tilled gardens where soil quality often declines despite increasing fertilizer inputs. Yet if permanent bed systems can produce food reliably year after year while improving soil health, why did they nearly disappear from agricultural practice during the 20th century? The answer has less to do with the effectiveness of the method and more to do with the transformation of agriculture itself. When tractors became widely available after World War I, farming shifted toward mechanization at a scale that permanent beds could not accommodate. Tractors required large open fields where equipment could move efficiently without obstruction. Permanent raised beds, by contrast, occupied fixed positions that machinery could not easily navigate. Plowing became the standard soil preparation method, not because it was better for soil health, but because it was compatible with the equipment farmers were investing in. Agricultural education followed the same direction. Universities and extension services taught tillage-based systems because those were the methods that scaled to commercial operations. Small-scale intensive techniques practiced by market gardeners were not included in the curriculum, and as older practitioners retired, much of that knowledge disappeared from formal instruction. Chemical fertilizers reinforced the shift. When synthetic nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium became affordable and widely available, farmers no longer needed to build soil fertility through biological processes. Nutrients could be delivered directly in measured doses, and soil itself became less important as a living system and more important as a physical medium for holding plants upright. Speed replaced patience. Efficiency at scale replaced careful observation. And the permanent bed systems that had fed cities for generations became relics of a pre-industrial past that no longer seemed relevant. This was not a conspiracy to suppress useful knowledge. It was a structural shift in which agriculture optimized for goals that permanent beds were never designed to achieve. Large farms needed methods that worked across hundreds or thousands of acres, and permanent beds work brilliantly at small scale, but do not translate to industrial operations. The knowledge did not disappear because it failed. It disappeared because the system that replaced it was solving a different problem entirely. But the problems agriculture faces today are no longer the same problems that drove mechanization a century ago. Soil degradation has become a global concern as decades of intensive tillage have depleted organic matter and eroded topsoil faster than natural processes can replace it. In many agricultural regions, soil that once supported abundant crops now requires increasing amounts of fertilizer to produce the same yields, and even then, productivity often declines over time. Water availability has become less predictable. Droughts last longer, rainfall arrives in more concentrated bursts, and irrigation systems struggle to compensate for the loss of soil structure that once held moisture in reserve. Tilled soil, with its collapsed pore spaces and weakened aggregates, cannot absorb water as effectively as undisturbed ground, which means more runoff, more erosion, and less water available to plants during dry periods. At the same time, food supply chains have revealed vulnerabilities that were easy to ignore when everything functioned smoothly. Disruptions in transportation, labor shortages, and inflation have all affected the cost and availability of fresh produce, and many households have begun reconsidering how much of their food security depends on systems they cannot control. Permanent bed gardening does not solve these problems at an industrial scale, but it offers a practical response at the household and community level. A small backyard plot managed as a no-dig system can produce fresh vegetables throughout the year without requiring expensive equipment, synthetic fertilizers, or constant physical labor. The system is accessible to people who cannot manage the physical demands of traditional gardening. Because the soil is never turned, there is no heavy digging required after the initial setup. Older gardeners, people with limited mobility, and those recovering from injury can maintain productive beds without the strain that conventional methods impose. The system also works in small spaces. Urban lots, suburban backyards, and even sections of larger properties can accommodate 5 beds without requiring the kind of acreage that traditional row gardening demands. And because undisturbed soil sequesters carbon rather than releasing it, permanent bed systems contribute to climate mitigation in a small but measurable way. Each bed that remains unplowed keeps carbon locked in stable organic compounds instead of allowing it to escape into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. For anyone interested in building such a system, the starting point is simpler than most gardening advice suggests. The first bed does not require perfect conditions or elaborate preparation. It requires a location that receives at least 6 hours of sunlight daily, access to water, and relatively level ground. The construction process begins by marking the bed outline, 4 feet wide and whatever length fits the available space. Existing grass or weeds do not need to be removed. Instead, cardboard is laid directly over the vegetation, covering the entire bed area. This layer blocks light and prevents plants underneath from growing while allowing water and air to pass through. On top of the cardboard, 4 to 6 inches of compost are spread evenly across the surface. The bed can be planted immediately into this compost layer, or it can be left to settle for 2 to 4 weeks while the cardboard begins decomposing and earthworms start moving upward into the new material. Most beginners make the mistake of building all 5 beds at once, which creates more work than necessary and increases the chance of errors during the learning phase. Starting with 1 or 2 beds allows time to understand how the system behaves before expanding further. The first season should focus on easy crops, lettuce, beans, tomatoes, that establish quickly and tolerate minor mistakes. As confidence builds and soil biology strengthens, more challenging crops can be added in subsequent years. Maintenance remains minimal once the beds are established. Each season, a fresh layer of compost is added to the surface, usually 2 to 4 inches depending on what is available. Crops are planted immediately after the previous harvest finishes, keeping the bed in continuous production. Crop families rotate between beds each year to prevent disease buildup. Paths between beds are mulched with straw, wood chips, or cardboard to suppress weeds and keep soil from compacting where feet travel regularly. Common mistakes include building beds too wide, which makes the center unreachable without stepping on the growing area. Others forget to rotate crops and plant the same family in the same bed year after year, which allows pests and diseases to accumulate. Some apply insufficient compost initially, expecting the soil underneath to provide fertility before the biological system has had time to develop. Realistic expectations help avoid frustration. The first year, yields will be moderate as the soil transitions from its previous state into a functioning no-dig system. By the second year, as microbial populations expand and soil structure improves, productivity typically increases noticeably. By the third year and beyond, the system stabilizes into consistent production that requires less intervention over time rather than more. 5 beds, each 4 feet wide, arranged in parallel rows with paths between them. From above, the geometry looks almost too simple to matter. But beneath that simplicity lies a different understanding of what soil actually is. Not dirt waiting to be conquered with machinery and chemicals, but a living system that functions best when left to organize itself. For most of the 20th century, agriculture moved in the opposite direction, prioritizing speed and scale over biological complexity. That transformation fed billions of people and remains essential to global food systems today. But it also created a gap between what industrial farming can achieve and what individual households need. A family does not require 1,000 acres of monoculture. It requires fresh food throughout the year, grown in a way that does not degrade the soil or demand constant external inputs. Permanent bed systems offer exactly that, not through technological innovation or complex techniques, but through cooperation with processes that have regulated soil fertility for millions of years before humans began farming. The knowledge was never lost completely. It survived in the practices of small-scale growers, in the observations of gardeners who noticed that undisturbed soil performed better than ground that was turned each season, and in the historical record of market gardens that fed entire cities from plots smaller than most suburban lawns. What is happening now is not discovery. It is recognition. 5 beds can feed a family not because the system is miraculous, but because it remembers what soil is and works with that reality instead of against it. The beds remain in place. The soil stays alive. And the food keeps coming season after season, without the need to start over every spring.